Deep within the soils of Earth could be problems for humanity down the road. It wouldn't be the first time, and it likely won't be the last, even if humanity goes missing by our own hand. This process seems as natural as the sun rising. As Earth's temperature fluctuates between fairly warm and bitter cold, invariably some microorganisms will get trapped within the frozen soils. As Earth warms back up, these are released thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not millions of years later to an entirely different ecosystem. Any animal could have popped up in the meantime with either a complete immunity to that organism or an extremely compatible physiology. If it's the latter over the former, that's not really a great outlook for that species. In the events of Black Mountainside, humans do what humans love doing, digging up evidence of our past, smoking corncob pipes, and then saying indubitably. But one of the considerations that we may not usually think about is unearthing something with it. As hallucinations begin to run rampant through an outpost, a horrific creature is seen and heard by everyone who's afflicted. But what exactly is this creature, and do I believe it's even real? Well, let's discuss the Brodmann's area of the brain, ventricular degradation within the brain, and how this creature may not even really be present at all. But first, this episode is sponsored by Factor. What is Factor? Well, if you've watched this channel for any amount of time, you'll know that these delicious meals are delivered fresh and never frozen. Best of all, they're delivered right to your doorstep. Eat stress-free this summer with Factor. With over 35 meals to choose from, including keto, calorie smart, vegan, veggie, or my personal favorite, which is the most Chad-like, double protein, because I actually enjoy building muscle at the gym, there's really something for everyone. Not to mention the over 60 choices to choose from of add-ons. Look, we all fall into the same trap, ordering takeout meals because it's super easy to do, and we all have lazy days where we just don't want to cook. These meals are typically unhealthy, and as a result, over time, our diet pretty much goes to crap, and our energy levels start to go down as we start to feel sluggish. With Factor's ready-to-eat options that take just 2 minutes in the microwave, you can have a smart, healthy meal rather than some junk that's not good for you. So they approached me like 3 years ago at this point for just an integration, and I still haven't stopped eating them to this day. So if you want to make better choices concerning your food today, then head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code Roanoke50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code Roanoke50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box and 20% off your next month of orders. All right, let's get back to it. But as always, I want to thank you guys for watching. Without you, I'd still be in the lab listening to Born in the USA, which arguably is not really that bad of a fate. I have a gaming channel now called Roanoke Games, trying to get that side project off the ground. If you enjoy me covering movies, you might enjoy me covering games there. And speaking of movies, come join my Discord as well, you huge nerd, so that we can do movie nights together. I think we're supposed to watch Abigail next week, if I remember correctly, but anyhow, let's get to it. We kick off our story in Canada, where the Canucks, whatever they are, that's their location. They appear to be just sort of vibing up there with less than 100 people in their population and some sort of taiga. Panning through, it's beautiful. I'm actually not joking, that is the ideal landscape in mind. A frozen lake, a glacier, a bunch of shacks with ominous words saying Black Mountainside written above them. What more could you possibly want? It's now November 1st, which means basically it is winter out here. 4 men are sitting around playing, I think, Ontario Hold'em, a worse version of Texas Hold'em. One guy wins, saying that the strippers are on him tonight, and that's actually a Chad move if you do use the winnings for that. One man, Robert, then talks about how he's gonna head to Florida for Christmas every year as the cameraman pans around the group, making me entirely too dizzy. Robert probably should have left a little early this year. Then they talk about their plans for the holiday season and what they plan to do on Christmas as another man, Jensen, plays video games away from the group. A helicopter arrives and I have to ask, shouldn't these cabins be a little warmer? Like everyone is wearing full-on jackets and gloves inside, which fun fact, if you wear your jacket inside, your thermoreceptors in your dermis will get used to that heat. So when you go outside, you will actually have the sensation of being colder. So if it's like 50 inside and negative 50 outside, take your jacket off so that you have something to increase the feeling of warmth when you get outside. I literally try to tell all of my friends this several times, but they are huge nerds who don't believe it's a real thing. You guys need to start listening to me. You guys is in like my friends IRL, but none of them really even watch my stuff, so I'm actually just screaming into the void. Anyhow, personal issues aside, Jensen then heads out where a man is holding a suitcase. The helicopter then nopes out of there immediately as it's touch and go. The other 4 men continue playing Go Ice Fishing. That's right, a terrible play on words, as Professor Olson has shown up. Drew did a paper on Olson's findings saying that he's super jazzed to finally meet him, and everyone here is pretty much either a doctor or a technician. Taking him to meet Steven, he then tells him, well, you have an impressive resume. The correct statement is, I've heard a lot about you. all bad. I look forward to working with you. That's how you meet somebody. Olsen then can't stand the cold as the men say, actually, it's a bit unusually warm out here. They show him some Clovis culture from assumedly 10,000 BC, as then they found a pot with some sort of structure and carvings on it. Olsen says, well, Clovis is not really that impressive, but they suggest that it's Mesoamerican, which then piques Olsen's interest. They're over 4,000 miles apart from the nearest Mesoamerican site, and there did not appear to be any cultural exchange with the people that were already up here. He goes on to say that they are unearthing a structure. They can't really say how far down it goes, and they really don't want to jump to conclusions, but it appears to descend quite a ways. This will be important for concerning what happens later. Currently, within the permafrost of Siberia, actually, scientists have found several different ancient viruses, and we have found some that actually infect humanity, which is maybe a bit alarming. Herpes viruses, pox viruses, really being the main concern, and as for viruses, obviously, pox viruses is something I want to focus on for a moment. While we have eradicated the endemic portion of smallpox in the population, meaning that nobody really catches it anymore, we still have it in some labs, which likely, if there's an outbreak, it could be used to develop more of a vaccine, but the reality is, we do not want this virus popping back up in any capacity. The reasoning is, smallpox absolutely wrecks populations and spreads like wildfire to those who have no immunity. And would you look at that? Because we have eradicated it, pretty much nobody has any immunity to it anymore. Now, don't panic too much because while vaccines are generally not given anymore, we do have enough smallpox vaccines on hand to vaccinate anyone who would really need it to prevent the spread, and we could always make more of it as well. But the point is, the permafrost melts, and this could release a form of the pox virus from quite literally millions of years ago that humanity may have not tangled with at any point, and this could create a problem down the line. So in that same vein also, other life forms exist. We have amoebas in the permafrost trapped in a frozen stasis that we have actually found, which is very strange. And bacteria, as always, remains plentiful. Honestly, bacteria being a major concern because anything frozen that may have gone extinct on the surface may be existing as an endospore. And I can hear you now. Roanoke, what is an endospore? I am so glad you asked. Bacterial endospores are essentially the most simplistic form of bacteria and the form that it can take, and they're also actually the most hardy. They consist of a DNA genome and a very small amount of cytoplasm. They take on this form because they coat themselves in a coating that allows them to withstand high heat, radiation, and even the vacuum of space. They do this as a survival technique and can exist for thousands of years in this form. The oldest viable endospore that we have found was over 250 million years old. Functionally, by our standards, when they enter this stage, they are effectively immortal. You can see how this would be a problem for humanity if some previously unknown bacteria has existed in the permafrost from time immemorial that suddenly springs back to life under the right conditions, which we'll get into that a little later on when we discuss what I believe is actually happening. So moving on, heading out into the structure, they show the professor as he asks how much sunlight they get, which is only about 5.5 hours, and then they stop work, usually about an hour beforehand so that they don't freeze out there. What do they do with the other 19 hours? Miller time. Heading back to their encampment, they then show the professor his cabin, which is actually pretty nice, and heading upstairs, that's where you want to be because heat rises. The guys then talk about how crappy the place is for a while, really hyping it up, as everyone does the same thing they always do, drink and continue to play cards. The cook comes back in to tell them that they need groceries. Another guy reads it and he says, yeah, we'll get that taken care of. It is now November 7th. Heading back to the dig site, the professor then says they have found several sites across 100 miles or so, and looking at the symbols, the professor says they are Mesoamerican symbols, but he looks over at another symbol and says they're really just images, they don't say anything. They also have no idea how deep this thing goes, as the professor suggests maybe 3 feet or so, given that the bedrock shouldn't be that far below. Jensen now gets on the radio and calls out to the helicopter people asking about the next supply drop. So on November 10th, they say they'll do the next drop. But it was November 1st when the professor arrived, and then the cook says like, hey, we needed the supply drop. And he's like, okay, well, I'll request that on November 2nd. So it took him another 5 days for this guy to get on the horn and then tell them that they need milk, eggs, and cigarettes. This guy kind of sucks. So heading back to the cabin where alcoholism is brewing apparently, for some reason the professor looks like Peter Dinklage in this moment. They raise a beer to whiskey and corn with a P, and also over their find. So they ask the doctor about what he thinks about the temple, and he says, well, who cares what I think? They then ask the professor what he thinks, and he says, well, I don't think it's a temple. He puts the structure at around 20,000 BC, which shouldn't be possible. Mesoamericans were not out there, and many humans weren't either. So the concept of aliens comes up now because it's too early for really anything like this to be there. So as they look through the rocks, one guy says, this is giving him a headache. No, bro, that's the consistent hangover. Although I do want you to note, he's getting a headache. It is now November 10th, milk, eggs, and cigarette day. Jensen now gets a call to come down to the site as they found the cat has been flayed and placed on the rock. Not my Dr. Mambo. Apparently, one of the men saw the other guy named McNaughton take out the cat, So now it's officially time to skin this guy alive and place him in front of the altar. They then call McNaughton and ask him if he took out the cat, and he's like, no, I didn't do that. Very convincing counter argument, my man. So they just automatically believe him. Okay. It is now November 15th. All I'm saying is if somebody took out my cat, which this is one of the guy's cats, I'm fairly certain I'm not gonna wait for answers. I know I wouldn't wait for answers. I would, if I heard it was this guy, I think it would just be on site. Anyways, it is now November 15th and things are starting to pick up. The professor then heads downstairs as they have lost 3 of their workers in the middle of the night and the other 2 went looking for them. They have no idea why they left. They found tracks heading back to the reserve, or at least they think they do, which means they're just now walking in 50 below at night. One man suggests maybe they were scared, but they don't know why they would be. Completely confused by them leaving, Jensen then leaves to go call in more workers. So as Steven sits there, he begins throwing up what appears to be straight blood. He has no fever at all, which is a bit odd but explainable, as then he's brought back to the doctor's office. This, however, again, is not completely impossible if it is the disease that I think it is. Jensen then heads back to his office and calls out but receives no call back. Heading back to the cabin, he says he couldn't get a hold of anyone, and then he sees throw up as Jensen suggests maybe we'll just go back to work until we can get a hold of someone. It is now November 18th. Jensen tells everyone to stay near their radio no matter what in case they get a call, as then they split up. Steven is now starting to feel like absolute crap, which actually puts us in line with what I believe it is. His condition has gotten progressively worse over the week. The doctor then runs the usual test looking for signs of infection, suggesting that maybe he has the flu, as there is clearly an immune system activity taking place in the body. He has no idea how he would have gotten anything since it's just been them out there. I mean, you just get the professor. He could have just gotten over the cold or the flu or anything. It had infected you. I mean, it's totally possible. But I will say this. What I like about this movie is it appears someone out there did their research in some capacity when it comes to this illness that we will discuss. So producers of this, or at least writers, good job. Like, I love when they actually try to do this and then they don't name the disease because it makes it more fun figuring out what it could be rather than being told, oh, this is what it actually is. So tracking the workers from earlier, Jensen is confused as to why they would even go this way. They had no supplies. Jensen then asks if anyone has been up here because the tracks actually don't lead to the reservation. The workers headed north, which most definitely had led to their demise. Back at the cabin, as they look at the symbols on the rocks, the professor asks why anyone comes up here in the first place. How was this stuff even discovered? Flannel then gets yelled at because he's just screwing around with stuff, which makes it awkward as we now jump over to a few men working on the generator. They have supplies for about 2 weeks at most, as the supply drop from 3 days ago never arrived. They get the Jenny fired up for the evening as it's now the next day. Testing out the radio once more, they then get nothing on it, which must be getting majorly frustrating. The radio does in fact work, but nobody is answering. It would seem to me that when it comes to this radio not working, it's really just stated that it could be a storm happening on the other side of the mountain, and as a result, not only can a helicopter not make it out, but radio signals can have difficulty moving over mountain ranges anyhow, and if you don't believe me, try calling someone when you're driving through the mountains. It's almost impossible. And given the remote location and how sporadic the communication actually is, it would appear that either a tower that is used to relay these signals has been damaged, or the storm itself is disrupting communication. It is known that in this area, winter storms can last for multiple days, with sometimes storms happening concurrently one after the other. And from what we will see later, the group becomes aware that a storm is happening where home base actually is, and as a result, they are grounded and it disrupts their signals, so nobody can get out to them even if they tried. So eventually it does break, but by then the situation has already devolved to the point where the men do not even bother reaching out, as we will see. I figured I would add this in there as it helps explain why this is definitely not a supernatural event, but simply a combination of problems stemming from naturally occurring bad luck. Anyhow, so Flannel Man then rigs up a loop to 98 to continuously call out as things are looking a little dire, but not completely catastrophic as of yet. The professor then heads back to the rock piles as Francis says maybe the rock piles are marking a hunting spot. He says the place is covered in bear traps, so don't worry about bears out here, but maybe deer were being hunted as well. Both the men have never heard of anything like this, and the radiocarbon dating suggests that the people who were here were actually around for a few hundred years. These people appear to have been totally isolated in this spot and then disappeared. Their original thinking was maybe it was just Mesoamericans who traveled really far north, got stuck in the winter, so they built an area to survive the winter and then left, but obviously they stayed there for a few hundred years. So what happened to them that they would all just disappear? Back at the camp, Flannel Man is just throwing snowballs at the wall because he's bored as Robert yells at him to go back to work, but there's never actually anything to work on because the equipment is fine. In the cabin, the professor keeps looking at the rocks with the symbols on it, and he says this is what you would see on Aztec pottery as well. It definitely looks like it's Mesoamerican, but there's nothing in their language. Maybe they are just images instead. Francis suggests that the people built the structure again to survive the cold, but then the Ice Age ended up taking them out. So that night, Flannel Man smokes in bed, which is incredibly smart, and it's now November 21st. Supplies would not be looking hot around this point. As the doctor then goes to check on McNaughton, he doesn't answer the door. He won't eat, and he says he's totally fine. He wants no food and water, but I guess that's a pretty good way to kind of keep your supplies in check, I guess. The professor is then awoken by radio contact as the doctor was heard screaming. He went to go check on Wells, and holding him down, he's violently thrashing on the table, and something is apparently wrong with his arm. And if we look at it, it appears as though blood vessel damage is actually taking place. They immediately then go and cut off his arm. I don't know why that was the move. They then give him morphine so that he chills out. Maybe taking off his arm wasn't like the immediate move, right? Like, also, I didn't see anybody try to stop the bleeding, and they seem to just be standing around. He would be absolutely spurting blood right now. So it's now November 26th, and Wells is most definitely dead from infection at this point. They used an axe to take off his arm. Robert then heads outside to smoke a cigarette, apparently shaken, as the professor asks about if people have ever been sick like that. Jensen and the professor argue, right? Like, they've been arguing like right now. It has been 5 days since they cut this man's arm off, so why is the doctor still covered in blood? Am I tripping? Like, this didn't just happen. Maybe I'm infected. So after that nice argument over at the camp not being properly funded, and now it's the next night apparently, everyone is just sort of vibing as Francis hears a voice whisper to him. He looks out the window but sees absolutely nothing. It asks him if he sees it, but he sees nothing. Robert the next day is going absolutely ham on some firewood for some reason, like literally screaming it. So from the sounds of it, aggression amongst the men is starting to increase. That said, no need to yell, my man, it's just cutting firewood. As an eerie ambience sets in, the situation might be getting a little worse. Jensen then walks over to the cabin carrying an extension cord, and as he goes to check on McNaughton, well, it appears as though he cut off his hand. McNaughton starts yelling at him as they have now had to hold him down. Over at the doctor's cabin, Robert then asks if the doctor has seen anything like this. The doctor tells him he won't make it if he stays there. They need to get him to an actual facility that can handle these wounds. They have him on an antipsychotic, but he's probably going to lose the rest of his arm as he made quite a mess out of it. It seems at this point, and this is critical, they have run out of antibiotics as they were never equipped to deal with this many exposure events just to standard infections. That night, the cabins begin groaning as Jensen cannot sleep. He then heads outside, hearing a voice in his head beckoning him into the woods. Yeah, typically you want to avoid anything beckoning you into the woods at night. Rounding a corner, he sees some men standing there. It is now November 28th. Jensen gets checked out by the doctor as he says he's feeling pretty tired. He wakes up and cannot get back to sleep. The doctor says it's probably just stress, and he says he's been having a dream though. He says it's not really a nightmare, as he says, I just see people standing there. They're like humans, but they're not. They watch him, but he's not really sure what to make of it. Back at the archaeology cabin, the professor is continuing his work on figuring out what this site actually is. He suggests it's some sort of deer god in a ritual site. The symbols on the pottery show people were evidently extremely disfigured. They were all missing appendages, so it appears some sort of illness ran through the area. As the ice melted, it seems potentially some form of bacteria may have been released on the people who were there. Everyone assumedly was taken out by this event, even after they had just lived there for hundreds of years. The professor says he's worried about Wells because if what happened to him is anything to go off of, then this bacteria is in the ice, and all the artifacts that they just pulled up means they are exposed to whatever this bacteria is that took out everybody else. Whoops. So Robert comes in the cabin and then tells Jensen that someone was snooping around the outpost last night. He says someone was outside his window and he was speaking to him. Robert suggests someone in their group is screwing with their resources and riling everyone else up. Jensen says he's insane as Robert brings up valid points about how everyone there is insane and then tells him to look into it. I'm not really sure what he wants them to look into, but it's like, okay. So here we have an actual explanation as to what's going on. As I have stated throughout this video, I believe that this is a bacterial infection, which we will see more examples of later that kind of support this point. But for now, let's discuss the symptoms so far and what supporting evidence that there actually is. First, the infection begins quietly enough. Once exposed to the actual bacteria, it would begin on the workers first, which is not really that surprising because they were the ones digging in the soils. This means the bacteria that has long been there would be in its endospore stage. Coming into contact with the unseasonably warm air as suggested by the people who have been out there, this would provide a more favorable environment for the bacteria, which can actually bring it out of its endospore survival technique and then bring it into its standard operation. From here, it's pretty clear how this happens. Either it's inhaled through the dust that they create, or it gets under their fingernails and then it gets on their hands, and then when they eat something, it's then introduced into their bodies. After this was accomplished, it would infect the workers, where it would begin to cause them to behave erratically and eventually leave in the middle of the night. It was discovered that they had not headed south to the reservation, but actually headed north by accident. And this would highlight that there was a bit of directional confusion as to which way they should go. With all the workers infected, they would be the first to exhibit symptoms, symptoms, and as the bacteria contaminated the pottery and materials they then brought back from the dig site, eventually the doctors, technicians, and scientists back at the main outpost would become infected by interacting with the artifacts and the men who were already infected. How Stephen became the first to be infected is unknown, but it may be that the men working with the artifacts wore gloves in order to not damage the recently pulled relics, which saved them from being infected earlier. As this infection took hold in Stephen, we start to see the pathophysiology present itself. First, it presented symptomatically as an inability to sleep. Obviously, this involves the pineal gland, which, if there's anything affecting that, can actually disrupt sleep. And as he got more and more tired, this would indicate that insomnia was beginning to affect him. He had no symptoms at first concerning a fever, but it's clear nausea would begin to take hold, which led him to start throwing up. Both of these symptoms are important because it indicates there is more of an infection in the brain area than in the entire body. So as everyone's favorite ailment kind of springs to life, we know what it is: meningitis. Meningitis is what happens when your brain begins to panic, well, not your brain, but your immune system begins to panic due to the presence of a pathogen internally. Now, typically the brain has the blood-brain barrier in place that can prevent infection from entering the brain tissue directly, which I believe it did effectively prevent. However, as the infection moved through the bloodstream, which can be seen when the arm possessed the black veins, this means that the bloodstream infection likely was causing the meninges to swell, increasing pressure on the brain itself. And this can cause a myriad of symptoms to arrive in the beginning, such as insomnia, increased aggression, confusion, and lethargy. However, what's interesting about it is it does not always inspire a massive increase in body temperature. However, as time goes on, meningitis will cause a fever spike. The reason this may not immediately take place is because the innate immune system is the first on the scene to respond. Inflammation is the first line of defense. Macrophages initiate inflammation at first as the cells release fluid to draw in more resources and assistance. So in your arms or legs or your shoulder, this is great. Well, kind of. In the meninges, though, surrounding the brain, this is really bad as it can cause brain damage. Eventually, the innate immune system will trigger the response of the adaptive immune system, and with it, fever will rise. But you can begin to have symptoms of meningitis without the fever first. This same pressure on the brain can also cause equilibrium issues, leading to nausea and vomiting, as we have seen with Stephen. So really, first and foremost, this falls right in line with how meningitis would present, or at least under some circumstances. But meningitis alone would not fully explain what is happening later with the hallucinations. And for that, we need to see what other symptoms are produced, which will help to explain why the brain is having difficulties dealing with what is happening and why its response is happening might seem a little off. So that night, Francis gets told to look as hard as he can past the trees and mountains, and he sees a kangaroo in the distance. McNaughton took himself out later that night also, and I can't show you any of that, as Robert got blood on him, as the doctor then does an autopsy to make sure what appears to have taken him out actually took him out. The doctor comes back with his findings saying that there were tumors under his skin. These tumors, though, were not human, as they appeared to be from an octopus or squid, which I think this has more to do with the doctor beginning to hallucinate than an actual octopus or squid infection, as we will talk about here momentarily. He says they were building on his muscle cells and that they would detach as then they head to the skin or spine. He says he was turning into an octopus of some sort, maybe thousands of them, and he suggests it spreads like tertiary syphilis. It moves from the spine to the muscle tissue to the skin and eventually the brain. They then ask what they should do, as they now need to sterilize the site, as the bacteria spreading is not exactly an ideal situation. They have no idea what this stuff is, so Jensen starts getting upset about it. So as we have seen with pretty much all the men, they're all hallucinating at this point. And it appears to me to be a psychological issue as much as a physiological one concerning how the infection is running, and I believe it continues to go back to the brain. The doctor, having a firm grasp on infections and physiology, is suggesting the cells are becoming octopus cells. He bases this one, I'm not really sure on what, because genetically he could not run tests to determine what sort of cell this is or what he could be seeing. But what I think he's seeing is the tissue necrosing and then breaking off of the muscle, creating these striation structures that appear like an octopus or a squid in the body. The issue is the brain is now struggling to maintain clear thinking patterns, so it's kind of going with the, I guess, most basic common denominator, where if you have a central structure with striations on it, it's like, oh, it looks like an octopus or a squid. So we see this infection does most certainly infect the bloodstream, and because of this, tissue internally would continue to necrose simply from the battle that is taking place with the immune system. Many different somatic cells would be destroyed, and it appears the muscle may may harbor some of these bacterial cells that have infected the person. The reason is bacteria can actually hide within fat cells near muscle cells, and because of this, much like the reproductive system in the brain, the fat cells are known as immune privileged sites. And this is why something like cellulitis or paniculitis is detrimental, because their source can be in the fat, yet they infect the dermis. Now, along with the damage to the muscle cells, causing them to break off and break down, the bacteria that I believe this to be also is known to have a higher chance of causing specific cancers to present themselves if this bacteria is present in the mix. This tumor formation, as the doctor has suggested, would put it right in line with the bacteria existing within the fatty tissue infecting the muscles as well. But it's also stated that it moves to the spine and then to the brain, and this is where the major issues arise. Once entering the spinal fluid of the body, the bacteria would continue to replicate itself, and given what I believe it is, you would need hardcore antibiotics to prevent it from continuing to grow in the body, and I'm talking like 6 days to several weeks of amoxicillin 3 times a day, and even then this bacteria is known to be antibiotic resistant, necessitating stronger antibiotics. The bacteria's very presence produces issues in the body, and it is also thought that it doesn't make toxins, which was preventing a system-wide issue with your body at first, but it does have real detrimental effects. Once entering the spinal fluid and building up in large numbers, it would eventually hit the cooling area of the brain where the spinal fluid flows, which are known as the ventricles. The interesting thing about the ventricles is they also serve several purposes, like the cooling as mentioned, but they also cushion the brain. They will also surround the brain entirely, not the ventricles, but the fluid will surround the brain entirely to keep it supported. Getting bacteria in there would further cause a freak out to your brain, but this spinal fluid, being that at least the brain itself, would show that the brain has actually been infected. Now you may be asking, how does that connect to the hallucinations? Well, we'll discuss that momentarily. Back to the movie. So as Francis walks, he then hears something telling him to come here. Heading to the cabin, he then sees the thing in the corner, a kangaroo with a deer head. He tells it there was nothing there. It then begins sowing the seeds of discontent as he says they think he's going mad and they are all talking about him. Bro, I would suggest not listening to that thing. He then grabs a knife as Jensen comes in saying that they're going to quarantine the artifacts. The deer then tells Francis to take out Jensen. He says the weather will break in a few days, so they will need to take advantage of that. Standing there like a total weirdo, Francis then holds off, taking out Jensen as he's starting to lose it. Heading outside, we now jump over to the professor. He decides to head outside into the cold with apparently it being windy, yet there was no wind in the trees. Not sure what's up with that. And heading up to the doctor's cabin, who then finds Francis has taken out another man claiming he was in pain. I think this is McNaughton. Everybody in this movie is dressed the same and they all have the same haircut, and it was really kind of frustrating. Anyway, so the professor then pulls the fire alarm, telling him to step back. Yeah, bro, getting out of there would be more of the move. He then asks, what did he do? As Francis says, he made me do it. He has a mental breakdown at this point saying, and just repeating the entire time, he made me do it. Everyone comes in a little shocked as to what he did, as they throw Francis into his room and block him in as Robert brandishes the force multiplier on him. Sealing him in? Yeah, things are looking pretty crappy at this point. The deer man now tells Francis he did a good thing. Again, why are you listening to that thing? As Francis sits down, it's now December 1st. The doctor then runs tests on everyone, finding the professor at least doesn't appear infected. The problem is that this is just a cursory glance, like they're not really having a strong immune response at first, because as he sits there with the body on the table, it starts breathing. The professor then calls out saying, who's there, as McNaughton starts talking to him. It begins speaking saying it lays maggots in the skin, the eggs in humans, and they survive in the eyeballs. It propagates its species as it calls humanity insignificant. Big talk for something that evidently needs humanity to survive. Olsen then goes ham on it, and he says it was speaking to him as he used the butt of the force multiplier to smash in McNaughton's face. The professor cannot remember the last time he slept, as the doctor says, you are hallucinating. The professor says, well, it seemed pretty real, as the doctor says, take these pills and go to sleep. So these hallucinations at this point are fairly consistent. If we look at the behavioral pattern of every man, we see that paranoia is increasing rapidly. Along with this, delusions are starting to come into play, along with the actual hallucination being visual and auditory, which may seem odd, but it really won't when I explain all this in a minute. All of these issues come together to form the idea that psychosis is building and leaving each man in this state. But what would cause this? It is observed that one of the first symptoms of schizophrenia is ventricular enlargement. As the ventricles grow, the reason is because like the tissue around them begins dying. With this bacteria infecting the ventricles and living within them, and the assumed necrotizing muscle from earlier, there would be no reason to think that the bacteria, that I think it is, wouldn't cause this issue around the ventricles and begin killing them off as well. This can induce paranoia, delusions, and aggression, as we have seen. Along with this, the deer god was talked about at the beginning beginning because of the locals. The entire group knew the original people here lost limbs and talked about a deer god. They were hallucinating as well due to the infection, but it gave the Outpost group an idea to latch onto that now became their hallucination as well. And obviously, the big thing is, I think it's Brodmann's Area 17 is for simplistic visual hallucinations, like you may see colors or lights, but when Brodmann Area 19 in the visual cortex becomes essentially damaged by probably the meningitis that is happening, you will start to have complex visual hallucinations, which means you can see people there, see things walking around you, faces, pretty much everything. And on top of that, the auditory hallucinations coming from the temporal lobe because of the same meningitis pressure. All of this comes together to create these hallucinations. But one of the biggest indicators to me that someone, again, did their research is the phrase laying eggs in your eyes. Sounds odd, but when you approach it as this bacteria that I think it is, and it's causing all of these symptoms, it's almost dead to rights. This bacteria causes infections in the eyes as well when exposed, along with like your sinuses and ears. And I'm gonna name drop this bad boy in a moment, but what do you think it is? Tell me down in the comments. And don't wait till the end, just say it now, I'll know. So the next day, the weather still looks pretty crappy as Francis has evidently not slept based on how he's looking. Jensen comes in bringing him soup as Francis asks if he can see him. Jensen then says, I don't see anything. Francis says he can't move without him watching and continues to say that he made me do it. Jensen asks where he is as Francis says he's standing right behind you. He's standing there watching you and touching you. Okay then, Francis then says he's a deer, but he doesn't know what he is. Francis then asks Jensen to stay, but he leaves him here with the deer thing because I would be getting out of the room too. Francis then yells out as Robert listens to that crap. So Jensen then heads back to his cabin as Robert comes in checking on him. Robert asks where Jensen is going and he says the weather's gonna break in a few days, so they should hike up out of there to the reservation to get some help. Robert accuses him of trying to sneak off and leave them with the supplies. Jensen says, I'm not ditching you. And I mean, Robert, why not go with them? So Robert is starting to lose it due to his lack of sleep as well and his own infection. Jensen later that night comes over to Robert's cabin asking when's the last time he slept. He has no idea when he slept. And Robert says he's fine because he doesn't want Jensen to take over the watch. Jensen then asks what he did to make him not trust him, which Robert brings up a good point. What did any of these men do before they snapped? It could be anyone at any point who becomes the next life destroyer. Jensen then throws him some food, but Robert says, I don't want that. He says he can make his own food. He does not trust anyone there. Stress will do that. So it's now December 4th as Robert heads over to Francis's cabin. He just straight up pops Francis on sight. That was pretty cold. Walking to the next cabin, well, Robert has totally lost it. He then takes out the doctor and then takes out the next guy in the next room. As then he heads to the next cabin and then takes a round from Jensen. Jensen then puts another round into him, dropping him permanently before walking up to him and putting in the kill shot. The professor and Jensen then find that both men are taken out and Jensen got hit in the stomach in the process. The professor says he has internal bleeding and Jensen says the doctor needs to go to the reserve by himself and pretty much tell him what's out here. So the sun is coming up in about an hour and a half and it'll be warmer then. He should then take the map and then head over there. So he does take the map and begins his run out of there as Jensen is now dealing with blood loss as the deer thing tells him to stop the professor. The professor runs to the pack and then grabs the map as Jensen then heads to the water heater closet to grab some important things. Pulling out the dynamite and gasoline, I'm guessing he's gonna blow the whole place. The professor then starts running out of the area as Jensen leaves a gas trail before bringing the dynamite to the generator, bleeding the whole way. As the professor heads out, he sees the deer in front of him telling him that he is not real. And then asks him, when an animal looks up at the night sky, what does it see? Thousands and thousands of tiny points. Then a man looks up at the same points and sees millions of stars, galaxies with billions of planets. It continues on asking if the professor or humanity was there when it created the stars or space or even time, and what does he think that the deer god sees when it looks up. The professor says he's leaving its home, and it asks, does he really think he's bound by this structure? How can it be omnipotent, omniscient, but not omnipresent? Well, it sounds like the ego is definitely omnipresent, that's for sure. The professor tells him that he's not God. God doesn't kill men like this. Well, I mean, oh God, don't bring up the flood. So it begins talking to Jensen about how he's not there to teach him or make him believe in anything. In fact, I don't believe this thing is really even there at all. Again, I think it's just the human brain grappling with decompensation event concerning its own functioning. So Jensen, like a baller though, is also being talked to by this thing, and he really doesn't care one way or another as he detonates the dynamite and the structure. So it is now December 5th. As the professor emerges rather cold through the woods, heading through the clearing, he then steps in a bear trap. Well, damn. And thus concludes Black Mountainside. So we have reached the end. So what do I believe this infection actually is? I believe it is a very, very old form of Haemophilus influenzae. This is a gram-negative bacteria and is known to do several things, such as cause eye infections, can induce meningitis leading to insomnia and behavioral changes, but it can also enter the spinal fluid, causing a massive amount of problems. But most interestingly, while it is not known to be generally toxic, it has been found to be present in those who had a propensity towards developing cancer. And this would mean it existing near, say, lung tissue, for instance, must have some effect on the genetic stability of somatic cells that it was affecting, which would cause issues in the tumor suppression genes. This bacteria is also known in some capacity to be resistant to 60% of our antibiotics, meaning probably what they had on hand would not be able to cure this if it actually did in fact turn out to be resistant. So because of this bacteria infecting everyone, which it is known to also exist in the permafrost layers right now actually, and it's actually highly infectious, it would spread to the workers first and then ultimately to the outpost. Initially, it can show up in the bloodstream as an infection and then progress from there if not properly treated, which the early outpost area, it's not going to be properly treated. Ultimately, this induced the hallucinations prior to the outpost being aware of this deer god, so to speak. Because of the people who were actually there first, who may have actually worshipped a deer god, it basically put the image in their head. So as the infection took deeper hold in them, obviously all the issues that came with brain damage would be there, but muscular damage also appears to have been a problem. Likely, this could have been solved, but a persistent storm back at home base prevented any help from getting to them, such as antibiotics. Ultimately though, my advice to anyone is you don't listen to the bipedal deer god telling you to take out people due to your own paranoia. It just never works out that well. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, leave me a like, review, baller review, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. Do you think this was bacteria, or do you believe it to be something else? Do you think it was actually supernatural? Be a cool guy and let me know down in the comments. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and Roanoke Games channel link in the description. But speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, I'd like to thank our astrophysicist, Death Dancer, and Feather. Thank you guys. Next, I'd like to thank our scientists, Dakota23, Invictus Echo, Lucian Dragon, Metric System, and Scoot Boo, as well as Virix Hellstrom. And to the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate y'all's support as well. It goes a long way towards helping everything out. So thank you. But all right, that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.